Taylor stood at the front desk, her heart pounding as the receptionist glanced her over with an air of disdain. The manager, Nathan, stepped in with a smirk, dismissing her request for a room with a casual wave. "This hotel isn't for people like you," he said, his voice cold. Before she could speak, security was already at her side, escorting her out. But as Taylor turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't end here. Something was about to change. Taylor Reed was tired. She had spent the last few days attending high-stakes meetings, flying from city to city, and navigating the kind of whirlwind schedule that left little room for anything but work. She had hoped that after her hectic business trip, she could just go home to her peaceful retreat, perhaps spend some time with her husband, Ethan. But as her flight landed in the city where his newest venture, a gleaming five-star hotel, was located, she felt an unexpected urge to stop by. The hotel was one of the newest and most exclusive spots in town. Ethan had spared no expense in making sure it was an opulent palace, something that screamed luxury at every corner. It was the type of place where elite guests came for special occasions, and people often showed off the wealth they had worked so hard to amass. The hotel's location was unbeatable, nestled in the heart of the city, with sweeping views of the skyline and surrounded by the kind of high-end shops you only saw in magazines. But today, Taylor wasn't looking for luxury. She wasn't looking for five-star service, high-end drinks, or expensive dinners. She had no intention of staying in the presidential suite or soaking in the spa-like atmosphere. What she wanted was simply a quiet room for the night, a place to catch up on some much-needed sleep. Taylor wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had no need to parade her wealth or flaunt her connection to the hotel's billionaire owner, her husband, Ethan. She knew that her modest clothes, a simple hoodie, a pair of jeans, and sneakers would not scream billionaire wife to anyone who happened to be watching. In fact, she preferred it this way. Taylor had always kept a low profile, shying away from the spotlight that Ethan's wealth often attracted. She wasn't someone who cared about outward appearances. She cared about the people she met, how they treated others, and how much heart they put into everything they did. And in that moment, she simply wanted to rest. As Taylor entered the lobby of the hotel, she couldn't help but notice the grandeur of the space. It was everything she had expected: sleek marble floors, chandeliers that hung like sparkling stars, and impeccably dressed staff who moved with a practiced grace. She stood in awe for a moment, taking it all in. It was easy to see why so many guests flocked here. The atmosphere was designed to cater to the most exclusive clientele, those who desired more than just a place to sleep. They wanted an experience. But for Taylor, this experience was not about luxury. It was about finding solace for a few hours before heading back to the hustle and bustle of her life. She walked up to the front desk where a young woman stood, her smile bright, though somewhat rehearsed. The receptionist, Jessica, looked Taylor up and down with barely a flicker of recognition in her eyes. There was something about Jessica's gaze that felt dismissive, as if she were already passing judgment. Taylor approached the desk, gave a polite smile, and spoke in her soft, calm voice. "Hi, I'd like to check in for a single night stay." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention her connection to the owner. She simply asked for a room. Jessica, who had been scanning the computer screen, paused for a moment and looked up. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, but it was enough for Taylor to catch it. Jessica's smile faltered, and her gaze swept down to Taylor's simple outfit. Taylor's hoodie, jeans, and sneakers might as well have been a neon sign to Jessica. "Not one of us." The judgment was instantaneous. It didn't take more than a second for Jessica to form her opinion. Her eyes didn't linger on Taylor's face or her gentle smile. They lingered on her clothes, on the lack of designer logos, on the absence of anything that could remotely signal high social status. To Jessica, Taylor was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in the refined world of luxury this hotel was built on. With a small smirk, Jessica leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting into something condescending. "Ma'am, this hotel is fully booked," she said. She didn't even bother to look at the availability on the computer, instead assuming that Taylor wouldn't be worth the effort of checking. "Maybe try one of the motels downtown," she added, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that Taylor instantly recognized for what it was: judgment veiled in politeness. Taylor felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her cool. She was used to being underestimated. After all, she wasn't one to flaunt her wealth. But there was something about this moment that rubbed her the wrong way. Maybe it was the way Jessica spoke to her, as if she didn't even deserve to be in this space. Or maybe it was the casual dismissal, the underlying assumption that because Taylor wasn't wearing expensive clothes, she couldn't afford a room. With a steady breath, Taylor didn't lash out. Instead, she politely responded, "Could you please check again? I'm sure there's something available." She didn't raise her voice or challenge Jessica directly. She simply asked for a courtesy that she believed she deserved, a basic level of service. But Jessica's reaction was swift and dismissive. She rolled her eyes, a silent declaration that she was no longer interested in entertaining Taylor's request. Without saying another word, she turned to the side and picked up the phone. The call was short, and her tone was clipped. "Nathan, can you come to the desk?" Within moments, Nathan Collins, the hotel manager, appeared from behind the curtain that separated the lobby from the rest of the building. Nathan was a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and a well-maintained suit that oozed the kind of polished arrogance that only a man in a position of power could afford. As he approached the desk, he took one glance at Taylor and immediately sized her up, his eyes narrowing as if he had already made up his mind about her. There was no hello, no greeting, just a cold, measured look as he took in her appearance. Taylor could feel the judgment in his eyes, the subtle distaste as he looked from her jeans to her sneakers and back to her face. "How can I help you?" he asked, his voice far more clipped than it had been when addressing the guests before her. Taylor, still polite but beginning to feel the sting of being treated like an outsider, spoke again. "I was hoping to book a room for the night. I'm sure you have something available. Could you check?" Nathan's lips curled into something that could only be described as a smile, but it lacked warmth. Instead, it was the smile of a man who had seen too many people like her, the kind of person he assumed wasn't worthy of the luxury this hotel had to offer. "We have a strict policy of accommodating high-profile guests," he said, his voice condescending and cold. "You wouldn't be comfortable here." Taylor's breath hitched, though she did not let it show on her face. "You wouldn't be comfortable here." The word stung far more than she had anticipated. The quiet insult in his tone was not just about her clothes, it was about her, as a person, being unworthy of the privilege of staying in his hotel. She was nothing more than a lower-class figure in his eyes, beneath his notice. Taylor stayed calm, her fingers curling slightly on the edge of the desk, her mind racing, but her voice steady. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said softly. "I'm sure there's a room available. Perhaps you could check again." Nathan didn't even blink. He wasn't going to waste any more time on her. "I've told you everything you need to know," he said, turning to walk away. But before he could get far, Taylor spoke again, her voice firm but not angry. "I'd like to speak with the owner of the hotel, please. I know him personally." At this, Nathan froze. For just a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it quickly morphed into mockery. "The owner? Honey, he's a billionaire. He doesn't deal with people like you." The words were spoken with a derisive laugh, as if he found the mere suggestion laughable. Other guests in the lobby began to glance over, sensing the tension, sensing that something wasn't quite right. But Nathan, oblivious to how the situation was playing out, simply waved over to one of the security officers nearby. Without a word, the guard approached and began to move toward Taylor. She had been humiliated. She had been dismissed. But more than that, she had been seen as something less than human, less than worthy of the respect everyone else in the lobby was receiving. Before she could say anything else, the security guard spoke in a low, almost apologetic voice. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Taylor stood still for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. She was being thrown out of a hotel that she owned a part of. The absurdity of it all hit her like a cold wave, but she said nothing. She simply turned, her back straight, and walked toward the door. As she passed the lobby's towering glass windows, she could see the other guests looking at her, some with curiosity, some with silent judgment. The whole experience felt surreal. How had it come to this? But deep down, Taylor knew one thing for sure. This wouldn't be the end. Something would change. She didn't know how, but she knew that Nathan's actions would have consequences. She just had to wait and see. The door closed behind her with a soft chime, and as she stepped out into the cool night air, Taylor didn't look back. Yet the moment she had left behind would remain with her, and she knew that in time the hotel would regret their mistake. Taylor stepped outside the hotel into the cool night air, her heart still pounding from the confrontation she had just endured. She felt the sting of humiliation burn deep, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something far more resolute. This wasn't just about a single moment of being insulted. It was about the way she had been treated, dismissed as less than worthy, disrespected in front of others, and ignored by the very people who should have been offering their best service. She took a deep breath and reached into her pocket for her phone. As her fingers scrolled to Ethan's name, she hesitated for only a second. Then, with a quiet sigh, she dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, and then, as the third ring sounded, Ethan answered. "Taylor? Is everything okay?" His voice was soft, laced with concern, and even though it was the middle of the night, she knew he was already preparing for whatever news she had to deliver. "I'm fine," she began, her voice steady despite the swirling emotions within her. "But I need to tell you something about the hotel." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a hint of tension creeping into his voice. "What happened?" Taylor explained the entire situation from the moment she had walked into the hotel to the humiliating way she had been treated. She told him about the way Jessica had looked her up and down, the dismissive tone in which she had been spoken to, and the outright condescension from the manager, Nathan. As she recounted the moment she had been escorted out, she could hear Ethan's breathing quicken on the other end. "I cannot believe this," Ethan said, his voice low but filled with controlled anger. "This is unacceptable." Taylor, though calm on the outside, was hurt by the realization that the staff, people she had trusted to represent her husband's brand, would treat her this way. "It's not just that, Ethan," she continued. "It's the way they thought they could get away with it. They didn't even bother to check who I was. They didn't care." Ethan paused for a long moment, then she could hear him exhale slowly, taking a breath to steady himself. "You shouldn't have been treated like that," he said, the words sharp with anger but laced with concern for her well-being. "I'm coming over there now. I'll make sure they understand the mistake they've made." There was no mistaking the fire in Ethan's voice. As a businessman, he had built his empire on integrity, respect, and a commitment to ensuring that everyone, regardless of status or appearance, was treated with the utmost courtesy. The thought that his own staff had failed to live up to that standard was something he would not tolerate. Ethan hung up the phone, and Taylor stood outside the hotel trying to steady herself. The cold air bit at her skin, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. She knew what was coming. She knew that her husband, who had always been protective of her, would not let this slide. But she didn't want to see anyone punished or humiliated. All she wanted was for the staff to understand the mistake they had made, to recognize how one's actions could affect another's life. Within 15 minutes, the scene at the hotel took a dramatic turn. Multiple black SUVs pulled up to the entrance of the hotel, their sleek bodies gleaming under the streetlights. The quiet hum of the city was briefly interrupted by the engines of the SUVs as they came to a stop, one after another, like a well-coordinated parade of power. The first to step out of one of the vehicles was Liam, the head of security. A towering figure, Liam's presence alone made the air feel thicker. Behind him, Taylor's personal assistant, Elena, followed closely, her demeanor professional but with a hint of concern. And finally, stepping out of the last SUV was Ethan, tall, confident, and unmistakably commanding. Taylor hadn't moved from the spot where she'd been standing, and as she saw them approach, a quiet sense of reassurance washed over her. Ethan's arrival was an answer to her frustration, a clear signal that things would be handled now, but part of her still wished the situation could have been avoided altogether. Ethan's eyes immediately found her in the crowd of arriving guests and hotel staff, and he made his way over to her without hesitation. The guests in the lobby turned their heads, some whispering, others staring in shock. The very fact that Ethan Reed, the billionaire owner of the hotel, was walking through the entrance, along with his security and assistant, was a rare sight. But there was something more to the scene now, something tense in the air that everyone could feel. As Ethan reached Taylor, he ignored the nervous glances from Jessica and Nathan. He didn't even acknowledge their presence as he walked past them. His focus was solely on Taylor, and when he reached her, he pulled her into an embrace. "Did they treat you well, sweetheart?" Ethan's voice was gentle, but carrying an undeniable authority. The entire lobby fell into an uneasy silence. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the hotel's air conditioning and the soft footsteps of the staff, who were now all frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Jessica's face drained of color. The smirk that had been there earlier was now completely gone. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. As her eyes met Ethan's, she knew that the man standing before her was not just a guest, not just a random customer. He was the owner, the billionaire, and she had just treated his wife like a nobody. Nathan, too, was visibly shaken. He had initially thought Taylor was just another guest with delusions of grandeur, someone unimportant. But now, as he realized who she truly was, the blood drained from his face. He tried to regain some semblance of control, but his usual swagger had completely disappeared. Ethan's gaze moved from Taylor to Jessica and Nathan, and without saying a word to either of them, he gestured toward the back of the lobby. "Show me the security footage," he said coldly, his voice carrying across the room. The staff, still stunned, exchanged nervous glances. One of the hotel managers, clearly intimidated, hurried to comply, leading Ethan and Taylor to a back office where the security footage was stored. As the large screen in the office flickered to life, everyone stood in tense silence, waiting. The footage began to play, showing Taylor entering the hotel, as polite as could be. The first image that appeared was Jessica at the desk, her condescending glance taking in Taylor's modest outfit. The camera zoomed in on the receptionist's dismissive smile and her eye roll, which was clearly visible to anyone watching. Then, the footage switched to Nathan stepping into view, sizing Taylor up and speaking with the kind of superiority that had been evident to everyone in the lobby. His dismissive gestures, the way he spoke to Taylor, the casual dismissal of her request, it was all captured on film. As the footage continued, Ethan's eyes never left the screen. He saw everything, the way Jessica laughed when she made her suggestion for Taylor to try a motel, the way Nathan waved off her insistence. Every slight, every rude gesture was visible. Ethan's jaw tightened, and a flicker of anger crossed his features. When the footage ended, the silence in the room was deafening. It was clear to everyone watching that Ethan had seen enough. He turned toward the staff who had been present at the time, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable edge. "This is how you treat my wife?" he asked, his tone icy. "This is the level of service I expect from my employees?" The other guests who had followed them into the back room were now murmuring among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. The footage had shown everything: the arrogance, the disrespect, the outright humiliation. Many of them were now beginning to understand just how far the hotel's staff had crossed the line. Ethan turned to Taylor, his expression softening for just a moment. "I'm sorry you had to experience that," he said quietly, squeezing her hand. But even as he reassured her, the weight of the situation was still heavy in the air. It wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The atmosphere in the hotel lobby had shifted drastically. What had once been a lively, bustling scene with the usual hum of business travelers and luxury-seeking guests was now charged with a suffocating tension. The staff stood frozen, most of the guests too stunned to speak. There was a palpable silence as Ethan stood at the center of it all, his calm demeanor only making the situation more intense. His quiet authority hung in the air like a thick fog, and it became clear to everyone that this moment was not just about a misstep. It was about consequences. Ethan didn't need to raise his voice. He never did. His presence alone commanded attention. His gaze swept across the room, and in that brief moment, it felt as though the entire hotel had held its breath. He had already seen everything he needed to see: the arrogance, the disrespect, the blatant mistreatment of his wife. And now, it was time for them to face the consequences. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Nathan, who had been standing awkwardly in the corner, shifting from foot to foot. The manager's face had lost all its color, his previously confident demeanor now replaced by nervous sweat and panicked glances. He opened his mouth, but no words came out as Ethan's gaze hardened. Ethan spoke in a voice that was calm but unyielding, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. This hotel was built to provide world-class service to all guests, not to cater to your personal biases. Nathan's eyes widened in realization. His stomach churned with dread as he understood that Ethan wasn't just upset. He was delivering judgment. The calmness in Ethan's voice made the situation all the more devastating. Nathan opened his mouth, stammering an apology, his voice barely audible. "Please, Mr. Reed, I didn't mean to—" Ethan cut him off with a simple motion of his hand. "You told my wife she didn't belong here. Now, neither do you." The words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with finality. Nathan's face paled further as the weight of his actions came crashing down on him. The room remained silent, the eyes of the hotel staff and the onlookers now fixed on Nathan. He began to shake, the truth of his fate settling in as Ethan turned away from him, making it clear that this was not up for debate. Without any more words, Ethan turned to the head of security, giving a brief nod. The security personnel stepped forward, their presence a silent command for Nathan to leave. The manager's feet, as if moving of their own accord, shuffled toward the door, his entire body trembling. As the doors of the hotel swung open, Nathan stepped out, a man stripped of his power, his confidence shattered. The quiet humiliation that accompanied his departure was a testament to the extent of his fall. He had been the one who made others feel small, only to realize, too late, how easily the tables could turn. The guests in the lobby exchanged quiet murmurs, the reality of what they had witnessed sinking in. But the consequences weren't over yet. Ethan's gaze now fell upon Jessica, the receptionist who had also participated in the humiliation of his wife. Jessica had stood by, watching everything unfold, her face now a mask of guilt and fear. The smirk that had once graced her face was gone, replaced by a tear-streaked expression of regret. Her eyes were wide, and she trembled slightly as Ethan's eyes met hers. There was no room for pleading or excuses. She knew deep down that she had played a part in the unfair treatment of Taylor, and she knew now that there would be no escape from the consequences. Before Jessica could speak, Ethan turned toward her, his gaze hardening. "You thought you were better than my wife, didn't you?" His voice was steady, but the bitterness in it was evident. "You thought her appearance gave you the right to dismiss her, to make her feel unworthy of this hotel." Jessica opened her mouth, but no words came. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she choked on the sob that threatened to break free. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, I didn't mean—" But Ethan was not swayed. His expression softened slightly, but it was clear that he was not going to let her off easy. "Maybe cleaning the rooms will teach you to respect those who check into them," he said, his voice devoid of anger, but laden with the weight of a lesson that had to be learned. Jessica's face crumpled as she gasped, her hands trembling in front of her. She looked at Ethan, her heart racing, the reality of her punishment settling in. She had expected a reprimand, maybe a warning, but she hadn't anticipated this. The idea of being demoted to cleaning duties was a sharp contrast to the high-status position she had once held. It was a humbling fall from grace, and it would be a painful reminder of her actions. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she stammered, but Ethan wasn't interested in her excuses. He had seen enough of people who excused their actions because of their own privilege. Jessica needed to learn the consequences of her arrogance. He turned to the staff behind her, his gaze unwavering. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Ethan said, his tone resolute. "Arrogance leads to downfall. Humility leads to respect. No one is above being treated with kindness and dignity, no matter their station in life." Jessica's sobs were quiet now as she was led away, her head hanging low. She had been given a hard, public lesson in humility, and there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. As she left the lobby, her fellow employees watched her go, the reality of her fall from grace serving as a warning to them all. After the consequences had been dealt with, and the staff began to process the swift and severe judgment passed by Ethan, his demeanor shifted once again. He turned back to Taylor, his wife, his gaze softening as he approached her. It was clear to everyone now that, despite his harsh actions toward his staff, Ethan's priorities were different. His focus had always been on Taylor and ensuring she was treated with the respect and dignity she deserved. He stepped closer to her, taking her hand in his and leading her toward the elevator. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he murmured softly, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "You shouldn't have had to face that kind of treatment. It's not right." Taylor squeezed his hand in return, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she said quietly. "I'm just glad that it's over." As they reached the elevator, Ethan punched in the code for the top floor, and the doors slid open to reveal the luxurious presidential suite. Taylor had never been in this particular suite before, but she could tell from the moment she stepped inside that it was beyond anything she had experienced at the hotel. The furnishings were opulent, with deep plush couches, gold-trimmed mirrors, and a panoramic view of the city skyline. It was a place of luxury and comfort, a stark contrast to the way she had been treated just hours before. Ethan guided her inside, his eyes scanning the room as if ensuring everything was perfect. "You deserve this," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You should never have been made to feel less than anyone else. Not in my hotel, and not in any hotel." As Taylor took in the beauty of the room, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had been wronged, but in that moment she knew that Ethan's actions had righted the wrong. She had been humiliated, but now, as she stood in the grandeur of the suite, she felt empowered. The balance had been restored, and the hotel that had once rejected her now embraced her with open arms. Before they left, Ethan made one final decision. He issued a new policy for the hotel, a policy that all employees would be required to undergo humility and customer service training, focusing on treating every guest with respect, regardless of their appearance, status, or background. This was no longer just about his hotel. This was about creating a culture of respect that would permeate every level of the business. As they prepared to leave, Taylor turned to Jessica, who was still working in the halls. Her eyes were downcast, but Taylor knew the woman had learned something that no one else in that hotel would forget. Approaching her quietly, Taylor spoke softly. "We all make mistakes, but learning from them is what matters." Jessica looked up, her eyes filled with shame, but also something else: understanding. It was clear that in that moment, she realized the true value of humility, and Taylor's words had planted a seed of growth. With that, Taylor and Ethan left the hotel, knowing that the lesson had been learned, not just by Jessica and Nathan, but by every single employee who had witnessed the events unfold. And in the end, the hotel became a place where no one, no matter who they were, would ever be made to feel less than they truly were.